Marissa stood at gate 22, watching the line of passengers shuffle forward with quiet impatience. The airport smelled faintly of coffee floor polish, and something older, something tired. Maybe that was just how she felt after 12 days straight on duty, but today felt different, somehow heavier in the air. She checked her watch, then looked up at the digital board, Flight 1175 Chicago, on time. She nodded to herself, quietly, already imagining the moment. She would finally sit down, once the plane was in the air, maybe close her eyes for a minute, maybe read a page of the paperback stuffed in her tote. People passed her in waves, a mother with 2 crying toddlers, a businessman, too busy for eye contact, a couple who looked like they were still angry from last night's argument. Marissa had learned to read people over the years, but this morning her mind was foggy until she saw the woman. She was young, maybe mid-20s, no luggage, no jacket, just a faded green shawl draped over her shoulders, and a small worn boarding pass in one hand. Her other hand supported her lower back as she walked slowly toward the gate, her stomach round and firm, pressing against the fabric of her dress. Pregnant, Marissa thought, very pregnant. The woman's face was pale, too pale. Her skin had that soft sheen of someone running a fever, or maybe in pain, and her eyes, they kept moving left and right as if expecting someone or maybe avoiding someone. Marissa straightened up suddenly, wide awake. Her fingers moved to accept the boarding pass. But she looked first into the woman's eyes before saying, "Good morning. Are you feeling okay?" The woman nodded too quickly, then smiled in a way that seemed rehearsed, like it had been practiced in a mirror. Her voice came out soft and careful. "I just need to get home. My family's waiting." Marissa scanned the boarding pass, but noticed it was creased, smudged at the edges, and the ink had faded in a way that didn't feel right. She had seen fake passes before, usually printed by scammers or confused tourists. This one looked oddly real and oddly wrong. She looked back up at the woman, whose hands now gripped the shawl tighter, like she was cold, despite the warm morning sun filtering through the terminal windows. "Do you have ID?" Marissa asked gently, not accusing, just routine. The woman's lips parted, then closed again. Her throat moved like she swallowed something bitter. "I lost my wallet this morning at the station," she said, eyes glistening. "I can't miss this flight, please." There was something off in the tone, something rehearsed maybe, or just too desperate. Marissa felt a small knot forming in her stomach, the kind that had saved her more than once in this job. Behind the woman, the line began to grow. Impatient murmurs rippled through the passengers, but Marissa didn't take her eyes off the woman. She felt the shift in the air before it even happened. The kind of moment when instinct speaks louder than rules, and everything in you tells you to pay attention. Because something was very wrong, and Marissa had just begun to realize how wrong it really was. The woman stood there, still gripping the shawl with white knuckles, her breathing shallow and quick, her chest rising and falling like she had just climbed a flight of stairs and was trying to pretend she had not. Marissa had seen stress before, nervous flyers panicking just before boarding, people running late begging for mercy, but this felt different. This was not fear of flying, this was fear of being caught. She tried again, her voice lower, softer, more personal. "I need to see your ID, miss. Without it, I can't let you through. The system won't allow it." The woman looked at her for a long moment, then glanced behind her, as if she were watching for someone to appear. But the hallway was empty. The only sound was the low rumble of a nearby gate and the distant voice of an overhead announcement. Then she said something so softly Marissa almost missed it. She said, "I'm not supposed to be here." "What do you mean, not supposed to be here?" Marissa asked, trying to keep her tone, even trying to understand. But the woman shook her head and stepped back, one foot moving slightly behind her, like she might turn and bolt for the hallway. Marissa's hand gently moved toward her earpiece. She wasn't going to call security, not yet. She just tapped it once and waited to see what the woman would do next. Passengers were now watching the two of them, some whispering, some irritated, some curious. But the woman didn't seem to notice. She was staring at the ground like she was doing some math in her head. Then suddenly she looked up again, her eyes wide, her voice sharp. "I have to get on this plane. You don't understand. It's life or death." And with that, she took a step forward past the scanner, but Marissa instinctively raised her arm and blocked her path, not roughly just enough to stop her. The woman froze completely, her whole body going still like a deer before headlights, and Marissa felt her own heart start to beat faster. "Tell me what's going on," Marissa said again, quietly, almost pleading. But the woman didn't speak this time. Instead, she took a deep breath, held it, and then something shifted in her eyes. It was like watching a mask slip off. Because suddenly the fear was gone, not entirely, but it had changed. It was no longer panic now. It looked like regret, like resignation. Marissa realized she was shaking slightly, not from fear, from the weight of a decision falling in the space between instinct and protocol. And before she could say another word, the woman's knees buckled, and she collapsed right there in front of the scanner. "Passengers!" gasped. Someone shouted for help, and Marissa dropped to the floor, instinct taking over again as she reached for the woman's wrist, checking for a pulse, feeling the heat pouring off her skin. But something felt wrong. It wasn't just the collapse. It was the strange weight in her abdomen. Like something solid was underneath. Like something that didn't belong. And Marissa knew whatever this woman was hiding, it wasn't just fear. The crowd started gathering fast, people leaning over the ropes, peering down, some filming on their phones, some asking what happened. But Marissa tuned them out. Her full focus was on the woman lying motionless on the floor. She kept her hand on her wrist, counting seconds, trying to find a steady rhythm, but the pulse was weak, erratic, like something was fighting inside her. Marissa had done first aid training every year. She knew the steps: check, airway, call for help, keep the person calm. But nothing in that training had prepared her for the look in the woman's eyes. They were half open, not quite conscious, but not gone either, like she was floating between two worlds, and stuck in the middle was something she hadn't told anyone. Airport staff rushed over, one of them speaking into a walkie, another kneeling with a small medical kit. Marissa moved aside slowly, still watching, still waiting for the woman to speak again. She whispered something barely audible. Marissa leaned closer, closer still, until she caught the word. "Locker." "What locker?" she asked. "Where?" But the woman didn't reply. Her lips moved like she was trying to say more, but her voice was gone, and her head tilted to the side, eyes fluttering. Paramedics arrived with a stretcher, and one of them started unwrapping the shawl to check her breathing. That was when Marissa saw it, not just the shape, but the straps. Straps across her stomach, under the dress, tight, unnatural. Marissa's breath caught in her throat. It was not a pregnancy belly, not the way it looked from up close. It was too smooth, too hard, and too still. The paramedic froze too. He looked at Marissa, then back at the straps, then slowly pulled the fabric back, revealing something wrapped tight in layers of cloth. The crowd went quiet. Someone whispered, "Is that a bomb?" But it wasn't. It was cold to the touch, covered in frost from cooling packs, and tightly secured around her abdomen. One of the vials peeked through the cloth with a medical label printed in small, sharp text. Marissa didn't recognize the code, but she saw the words "restricted use" and "experimental batch," and her blood ran cold. This wasn't about fear of flying or a lost ID. This woman was transporting something illegal, maybe stolen, maybe dangerous, and pretending to be pregnant to do it. Marissa stepped back as security cleared the space, and one of the agents muttered, "We need to notify federal authorities now." But Marissa couldn't stop thinking about that one word. Locker. Had she dropped something off before arriving at the gate? Was there more to this than what they had found strapped to her body? She looked around the terminal, scanning faces, doorways, shadows. Because if the woman wasn't working alone, Someone else might still be out there watching, waiting, or worse, heading toward another flight. And whatever was inside that locker, if it existed, could be far more dangerous than anything they had found so far. Marissa stood near the terminal glass, watching the paramedics wheel the woman away, surrounded by police and airport security. Her shawl had been folded neatly on the stretcher, her eyes now fully closed. The silence around her felt too loud. Her heart beat like a quiet drum in her ears as the crowd slowly scattered, and the flight announcement continued in the background as if none of it had happened. But it had happened, and she couldn't shake the sound of that one whispered word. Locker. She turned, quickly scanned the hallway near the security checkpoint, then past the vending machines, past the chairs bolted to the floor. Her feet started moving before she even decided to move her steps quick, but steady. She didn't want to alert anyone. She didn't want to call attention in case someone was watching. Something in her gut told her this woman hadn't acted alone. No one would go through all this just for a few vials. Something bigger was in motion, and it was unfolding right here, right now. She walked past the bathrooms, the gift shop, the currency exchange, then stopped at the corner where the old lockers stood, rarely used anymore since most airports banned them for security, but a few still worked for authorized storage. There were 12 steel lockers, grey, dented, some with scratches, some with faded numbers taped across them. Marissa stared for a moment, her breath shallow. She didn't even know what she was looking for, but something kept her there, like her feet were locked to the tile. A man in a navy uniform passed behind her, pushing a cart. He looked at her for a second too long, then turned the corner without speaking. Her eyes moved across the lockers again, slowly, one by one, then she saw it. Locker 7, the only one with condensation on the door, just a light fog, as if something cold had been placed inside. She stepped closer, reached out, and touched the metal. It was cold, very cold, colder than it should have been. Her fingers hovered over the lock. It wasn't latched properly. Someone had rushed it, or hadn't wanted to draw attention. She looked around again, no one in sight. Then gently opened the door. Inside was a small black case with no markings, sealed tight with a plastic security strip, the kind used by medical transporters. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached in and lifted it. It was heavier than expected, solid, dense, and cold. The second she turned around, she heard the sound. Footsteps, fast, deliberate, coming from behind the vending machines. Marissa's eyes locked on the hallway, her grip tightening on the case, her heart thundering in her chest. She took one step back, and then the man from earlier appeared again, this time without the cart. And he was walking straight toward her. Marissa stood frozen for a second too long, her mind racing, trying to process what was happening. The black case felt like it was burning through her hands, heavy and strange, as if it carried a secret too dangerous to be in her possession. The man kept walking closer, his footsteps echoing across the empty corridor, and with each step his face grew clearer. It was the same man from earlier, the one who had passed her by without saying a word. Now he was staring right at her. Marissa's heart skipped a beat, and without thinking she shoved the case back into the locker, slamming the door shut in one motion. But her eyes never left the man's face. His eyes were cold, sharp, like he already knew something was wrong. He stopped a few feet away from her, his posture relaxed, almost casual, but his gaze never wavered. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, trying to act like she wasn't holding something she wasn't supposed to have. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice low and calm, but there was an edge to it, something calculating. Marissa felt her pulse quicken and forced herself to stay steady. "I'm just waiting for the next flight," she said, keeping her voice, even though every part of her wanted to look around to run. The man nodded slowly, as if considering her words, but then his eyes flicked down toward the lockers, and she could feel his attention like a weight. "I'm sure you are," he said after a moment. Then his lips curled into something that might have been a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. He took another step closer, and for a split second Marissa felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. "Is there something I can help you with?" she asked again, her voice shaking ever so slightly. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced at the lockers again, then back at her, his eyes narrowing just enough to notice. "No, just looking around," he said finally, as if dismissing her completely. But Marissa didn't move. She felt the pressure of his stare like a trap slowly closing in, and just as she opened her mouth to say something to break the silence, he took another step closer. The scent of his cologne hit her just before he spoke again. "I don't think you're just waiting for the next flight, Marissa." Her breath caught in her throat. The words hung between them, heavy and suffocating. And just as she thought she might speak again or run or scream for help, he glanced toward the entrance of the terminal, as if someone had called his name. But Marissa's attention snapped back to the black case inside the locker. He was watching her, waiting for her next move. She couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. Then the door behind her opened suddenly, and another figure appeared, a man wearing a black jacket and dark sunglasses. And the moment he stepped inside the hallway, everything changed. The new figure stepped into the hallway like he owned it, his black jacket swishing softly behind him, his eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses, but there was no mistaking the air of authority that followed him. Marissa's heart skipped a beat. She couldn't explain why, but something about this man felt dangerous in a way she couldn't put into words. He moved toward her without hesitation, his footsteps steady, slow, but sure, like a predator closing in on its prey. She didn't dare to look at the man who had been standing too close moments before. He was still watching her, the same calculating stare, like he knew something she didn't. The new man's voice cut through the tension like a blade, sharp and direct. "Are you finished here?" Marissa didn't answer at first, her breath shallow, her eyes flickering from the man in front of her to the man behind her, to the lockers where the black case sat hidden now. "I asked if you're finished here," the man repeated, his tone no longer calm but demanding. She swallowed and nodded, trying to keep her voice steady. "Yes, I'm just waiting for the next flight." He didn't react to that. Instead, he glanced over her shoulder toward the lockers, as if he already knew everything she was hiding. "Are you sure you don't have something for me, something I'm looking for?" he asked, his voice low, like he was speaking to a child. Her stomach twisted into a knot. She forced herself to stand still. She couldn't show fear. But how could she hide the truth if they knew about the case? "I don't know what you mean," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but her fingers clenched tight around her phone, tucked in her pocket, ready to dial for help. The man took another step closer, and this time she couldn't stop herself from stepping back just a fraction. He noticed immediately, his eyes narrowing, his lips curling into a small but knowing smile. "You don't need to be scared," he said, but she could hear the lie in his words. "You know exactly what I'm talking about," he added, this time softer, but even more menacing. The man behind her still hadn't moved, and now it was clear to Marissa that the hallway had become a trap. She was stuck between two men and the locker with a stolen case that could end her life if she made one wrong move. The air in the hallway felt thick, suffocating, like she couldn't breathe enough for the words to form. She looked around, her mind spinning for a way out, but every exit was blocked, every path seemed to narrow down to this moment. "What do you want?" she finally whispered, her voice trembling, but she was trying to keep her grip on the situation, trying to take control again. The man smiled wider now. It was like he knew something she didn't, and that made her stomach turn. "I think you already know what I want," he said softly. He stepped even closer, just as a distant sound echoed through the terminal. A voice overhead. "Flight 1175 is now boarding." Marissa felt a cold chill run through her as the seconds stretched, and she realized what that meant. If they knew about the case, if they were here for it, then she wasn't just dealing with airport security. She was dealing with something much worse. And just as the man reached out to grab her arm, she heard a sound coming from the lockers. A soft click. And the door of locker 7 slowly began to open on its own. The locker door creaked open inch by inch like something trapped inside was begging to get out, and Marissa froze, her heart pounding so loudly it felt like it would burst right through her chest. The two men both turned toward the sound in unison, their eyes locked on the slowly opening door, and for a split second Marissa saw fear flash across the man in sunglasses' face just as quickly as it was masked. The air felt colder now, as if the room itself was holding its breath, and Marissa couldn't tear her eyes away from the black case that had started it all. She could hear her own breath now, shallow and ragged, as she took one slow step backward toward the wall she needed to get away, but she had nowhere to go, and the man in front of her was closing the gap between them like a shadow. He didn't speak at first, just stared at her, as if weighing her every move, and for the first time since this whole nightmare began, Marissa felt a surge of panic rise in her throat. He reached down for the black case without breaking his gaze on her, and for a moment Marissa thought she might scream or run or do anything to break free from the suffocating silence. But then she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The locker door hadn't just opened on its own. Someone was behind it. A hand reached out from the darkness of the locker just as the man grabbed the case, and the hand jerked back like it had been startled. Marissa couldn't move her legs, felt like stone frozen in place, as the figure inside the locker finally stepped forward, a woman this time, a familiar woman whose eyes were wide with panic and fear. The woman from the plane. The one who had collapsed. She was alive. Barely. Her face was pale, and drawn her hair matted to her forehead, but it was her eyes that sent a shiver down Marissa's spine. Those eyes, they weren't the eyes of someone who had been hiding the truth. They were the eyes of someone who had been running from something far darker. The man with the sunglasses looked at her, then back at the woman, his hands still gripping the black case tightly. "This is your last chance," he said, his voice cold like ice. "Tell me where the other package is." The woman shook her head slowly, no more words escaping her lips, but the fear in her eyes told Marissa everything. She wasn't just a passenger, she wasn't just a victim, she was a part of something far bigger, something dangerous, and the case wasn't the only thing they were after. Marissa's mind raced as she turned toward the man in front of her. She had no idea what was happening or what to do, but she knew one thing for sure: she wasn't about to let this go. She stepped back, quickly glancing at the woman in the locker, her hands trembling, but she pushed through the fear and acted. In a flash, she grabbed the nearest object, a small metal tray from the nearby counter, and hurled it toward the man's head. It hit with a loud clang, and for just a moment the man faltered, his grip on the case loosening slightly. That was all Marissa needed. She grabbed the woman's arm, pulling her away from the locker, just as the man lunged forward, his hand swiping through the air. But it was too late. Marissa yanked the woman into the hallway, pulling her out of the immediate danger zone, just as the first few screams echoed from behind them. And then the sounds of footsteps came chasing them from behind. Marissa didn't dare look back. She ran. And she ran fast. Marissa's breath came in ragged gasps, her heart pounding in her chest, as she yanked the woman through the narrow hallway, the sounds of footsteps behind them growing louder with each passing second. She couldn't look back, she couldn't slow down, she just kept running around the corner, past the boarded-up gate, and into the shadowy section of the airport, where no one was around. It was the perfect place to hide, or maybe the perfect place to die. The woman stumbled beside her, barely able to keep up her body, still trembling from whatever had happened to her, but Marissa didn't dare stop. Her hands gripped tight around her arm, pulling her faster. The footsteps were getting closer now. There was no mistaking it. Someone was right behind them. And when Marissa risked a glance over her shoulder, she saw the man in the black jacket rounding the corner, his face a mask of pure rage. Marissa's stomach twisted with fear. She didn't know how much longer they could keep running, but there was nowhere to hide, nowhere to go except forward. She glanced down at the woman, who was starting to slow down, her face pale, her lips dry and cracked, as if she hadn't had water in days. "Where are we going?" Marissa whispered, frantic. "Now, please just tell me." The woman's eyes flickered, but she didn't answer. Instead, she grabbed Marissa's wrist and pulled her toward an old stairwell at the far end of the hall. Marissa hesitated for only a moment, but the sound of the man's voice shouting from behind pushed her forward. "Get down those stairs," the woman rasped quickly. "He's coming for both of us." Marissa didn't question her again. She ran as fast as she could down the stairs, her feet clattering against the metal steps, as she tried to keep her balance and drag the woman with her. They reached the bottom, just as the sound of footsteps came to a stop at the top of the stairs. The man was here. The woman collapsed against the wall, her body shaking violently, like she couldn't hold herself up anymore. Marissa looked around, frantic eyes darting between the shadows, looking for something, anything to protect them. But there was nothing. She cursed under her breath, feeling a surge of panic crawl up her spine. Then she heard it. A voice. Not the man's voice, but a new one. A voice from the shadows behind them. "We don't have much time." Marissa froze, her heart pounding like a drum inside her chest, as she slowly turned to face the voice. A figure stepped forward, a tall man dressed in all black, his face shadowed by the hood of his jacket, but there was something oddly familiar about the shape of his shoulders. "He's close," the voice continued, barely a whisper. "We have to move now." Marissa didn't know whether to trust this man, but the alternative was facing the other man above them, who would surely catch up soon. She glanced at the woman, who was barely conscious, slumped against the wall, unable to even stand. "We need to get her out of here," Marissa said, but her voice shook. The man in black nodded, his expression unreadable. "I know where to take her. Follow me." Without waiting for her to respond, he turned and walked into the darkness of the terminal. Marissa hesitated, but only for a second. She couldn't let the woman die, not now. She grabbed her by the arm again, pulling her toward the stranger as the sound of footsteps from above came closer. They had no more time. Marissa followed the man into the darkness, hoping this was the right choice, hoping she wasn't making the biggest mistake of her life.